Welcome to the Culture and Sports Podcast, where we have discussions about how leadership and organizational culture impact organizational success, team and athlete performance, and the short and long term mental, physical, and emotional health of athletes. The Culture and Sports Podcast is brought to you by Culture and Sports. Culture and Sports helps sports organizations, teams, coaches, support and front office staff, and athletes understand the importance of leadership and organizational culture and its direct impact to success. Please join Lori Okimura and Dr. Jeremy Piasecki in this season of the Culture and Sports Podcast. Welcome to Season 4 of the Culture and Sports Podcast. This season is going to be a little different than previous seasons. During this entire season, we're going to take a deep dive into a case study about a current toxic and abusive culture at a sports organization. We're going to explore the lived experience from athletes, speak to experts, and the investigative reporter who broke the story. But first, let me introduce you to our incredible guest co-host for this season, Lori Okimura. She is currently the president of World ParaVolley and has an incredible career. Thank you so much for being our guest co-host this season, Lori.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy, for having me on this season. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm the president of World ParaVolley, which is the International Parasport Federation for sitting volleyball and beach paravolley, standing beach paravolley. We're in the world of Paralympic sport, right? We're athletes with disabilities, but I come from a long background on the Olympic side of sports, particularly with volleyball and beach volleyball. And I kind of joke when I meet, new students and new people that I've literally had every job in my industry, and I've been lucky enough to stay involved in the volleyball and the sport world. But I've literally had every job. I've played the sport. I've made the products that we use to play the sport. I've been involved on the organization side, on the sponsor side, so whenever you have that opportunity to be involved in one industry and see it from different angles, it gives you a really unique perspective and sometimes a cynical perspective, right, on what you see. I started my career in the collegiate world of athletics and got what I think is a very good opportunity to experience a major high-profile athletic institution. I graduated from the University of Southern California, right? Trojan Athletics is storied for its sort of Fortune 500 approach, right, to the business of athletics. I had an opportunity to witness, several coaches at the university of women's volleyball, of other sports as well, men's volleyball, basketball, football, and I've had the real, I think, honor and unique opportunity to be mentored through the process. My area was media relations and communications for a long time and got some real amazing training, but that allowed me to have as close a view as you possibly can to the culture, right, to the importance of athlete safeguarding, right, and which is something very new, right? Even though we've had athletics and athletes for hundreds and hundreds of years, that we don't know or haven't been able to explore as deeply into the whole area of how do you protect those athletes, right? How do you provide resources for them, to access? And that's one of the reasons why, Jeremy, I follow your research, and I think it's very interesting also that you come from the coach, the athlete, the organizer, perspective. So you and I have a bit of that shared perspective, which I think is really important for this, for this particular season where we are going to dig deep into, into culture, right? So that's really, to me, I'd love to. I know we know each other, but I'd love to hear more about, that aspect of your career path as well.
So my career path has been pretty varied as well, and it's gone a lot of different directions. So I swam and played water polo growing up, and the only reason why I started swimming was because when I first moved from Brooklyn, New York to Southern California, I didn't know how to swim, and I fell into a pool, and some random person pulled me out because no one saw that I walked towards a pool and fell in. And my parents were like, "No, we need to get you to learn how to swim." So I started swimming. I loved it, and basically any type of swimming I did, or even water sport. So I even did diving at one point, swimming, water polo, and then I even got into open water swimming before it was a way bigger thing. There's only, a few hundred of us out there at any given event, unlike now where you'll see, thousands or tens of thousands like at Ironmans and stuff like that, or just triathlons. So I started coaching actually when I was still an athlete. I would help different age groups, in swimming and water polo. And then I eventually started leading programs. And then in 2008, I was in Afghanistan. I was in the Marine Corps for almost 25 years. I found a pool in a random area. I convinced the local elder to clean the pool up, which was full of trash, and to let me teach the locals how to swim and play a game called water hand soccer because there was no literal translation to it. And a few weeks later, the Afghanistan National Olympic Committee heard about what I was doing. They reached out and they wanted me to help them start a national water polo program and to help their just started that week national swim program. And I thought with helping, I would, help them for about a year, just get up and running. And it ended up being 13 years till unfortunately the Taliban retook over the country and really restricted the rights of basically every single Afghan in that country, which is incredibly sad. And the only other experience I have of with sports, even though I kept it very brief, was when I was in Germany from 2010 to 2014. I actually ended up playing professional water polo when I was a little bit older, which was an incredible experience. I even ended up coaching for a little time as well. So, in a nutshell, that is my experience. And then, moving on to my education. I have a doctorate in leadership in higher education. Specifically, my doctoral research was on organizational culture or toxic culture. And my research was on the lived experience of people who are adversely impacted by toxic leadership in organizations. So this season is definitely in line with where my expertise lies. Speaking of which, Lori, I'm sure in your career you've encountered at least one or many times, or at least became aware of toxic and abusive cultures. Can you please share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've had every job in my industry, right? And over the years, and it's been what, 34 years now, it, it doesn't surprise me anymore. Like maybe I'm a little bit more jaded, than I was when I first started out, right? I started working very, very young. And because of that, like oftentimes you find yourself, being disregarded because of your age or your gender or your ethnicity. And you become like, you hear that expression, everyone says, "Oh, I wish I was a fly on the wall, so I could hear, what was going on or, kind of get the inside scoop." Well, I was that fly on the wall, like
Mhm.
to be quite, graphic about it. People would forget you were in the room or, again, just sort of discount, what it was that you brought to the table. And because of that, I did have an occasion to witness, be a part of, or have somebody come to me for help over the years of very toxic, abusive situations, and in some cases, like actually dangerous, like to human safety, type of situations. I'll share a few with you, without jeopardizing any open cases or anything. But some of the ones that have stuck with me, over the years is that I experienced once, um, as a student, right, and as a high school student, walking into a college campus, and coincidence, whatever it was, right, there happened to be this major earthquake. As I was walking onto campus and going to actually observe a women's volleyball practice, right, and practice wasn't stopped because and earthquakes. You think people in this was in California. People in California must be used to earthquakes. Must be no big deal for them. Well, this was a really big one, right? This was the Whittier quake in 1987. And, buildings toppled, people lost, homes and structures, and freeways collapsed, and, and things of that nature, right? And yet the coach of this team continued not only continued practice during the quake, and the most violent part of it, the 30 seconds of shaking and stuff, but really like threatened the athletes verbally, like you better not seek shelter right now because we're in the middle of this drill, right? And that was not really the first time I'd seen something like that. I had a parent that was involved in high performance martial arts, who was pretty abusive, pretty I think not responsible for the duty of care that coaches and administrators have, over athletes, especially young athletes. So I had some experience, with abuse, unfortunately up until that age. But to see cases of, abuse and neglect and even cases where, athletes just felt uncomfortable, right, or anxious or unsafe. For me, it really hits home because, my athletic career stopped because of injury, right? And so, there's always a part of you that's like, well, how can I continue to stay involved, or what will be my role now moving forward? Because, you have that little kid's dream of, oh, I'm going to play sports my whole life, and you can at a certain level, but at the top levels, like it's not always possible, right? It's not always going to work out for everybody. So coming back to that, for me, anytime I have an opportunity, to get involved or to support or to amplify or be an advocate for, athletes in this situation, in any situation really, but it's shocking to me, so I was reached out to by a number of women from a college volleyball program where there was a coaching transition, happening. And, you don't want to break their confidence, right? You don't want to reveal, who they are if they haven't been able to reveal that themselves, but you also want to try to help guide them to finding resources, for help. That's the biggest problem, right? The question is always like, where can I go for help? Who's going to believe me? Right. And
Exactly.
especially if it's something that they've done that they feel might be misinterpreted or might be against the rules, it doesn't matter. Even if you break the rules, okay, you'll pay the consequence for that eventually, but it doesn't give somebody the right to hurt you, right? It doesn't give somebody the right to invade your personal space or abuse you. It doesn't matter what you've done. And so there were these 5 women that reached out, and I didn't really know any of them. One, it turns out I had a loose connection to, and a former coach of theirs called me up and said, "Hey, my athlete is really struggling. Um, can I give her your phone number just to talk some things out, as far as I don't know who else to send her to that won't either use this against her or retaliate, or, who might be recruiting her, and I'm not in that position, right? I can't do anything for anyone when it comes to recruiting or, or getting a scholarship somewhere. So I think I might have been the perfect option, at that time. And the basis of and it was 5 women that had a very central abuser, right? It was the same, unfortunately, it turned out to be the same, coach. And there was everything from emotional abuse to body shaming. In one case of one particular athlete, there was physical abuse, and that she had suffered a concussion from what we in volleyball call a coach on one drill, right? It's a one-on-one drill with the coach just firing. It's really, I don't even know what, I've seen it my whole life as a volleyball player, but I don't even know really what the purpose, deep down would be, but it's a commonly used drill. And unfortunately, she had suffered a concussion, as a result, but was forced to, this was before concussion protocols were instituted, for volleyball or for collegiate sports. And yeah, I mean, these volleyball athletes were just, they were suffering. And what's interesting about it is, um, one of the reasons why athletes don't want to report, right, and don't know who to turn to is that somehow it got, known that that I had said, these athletes had come to me for help. Nobody knew who the athletes were, right? We never talked about names, but there was a bit of retaliation, whether it was against me or the athletes themselves, by a media source in our sport, right? Claiming that the whole thing was pucky. No way could this coach who won all these things and accolades and, this guy's a great guy. No way could he have ever done this to these athletes. Well, nobody actually really knew what the athletes were alleging or what they had experienced. It was just simply this sort of mentality that, oh, but look at the win-loss record of this individual. He can't possibly be responsible for this kind of behavior. Right. And that's really what that what you hear so often is like, well, there can't possibly be, that can't possibly be true that this person is, an abuser because, well, look at their win-loss record. Look at their number of halls of fame that they're, inducted to, right? That seems to be the benchmark. And probably the worst, I mean, two of the worst cases, I had an opportunity to volunteer on the board of USA Volleyball for a long time and served in the capacity of its board chair for the last 5 years that I volunteered for the organization. And during that time, there had been a case. It had spanned at that time it had spanned over 25 years, and by the time everything had finished, with adjudication, it had gone over 30 years of a coach that was, you hear the phrases like the worst kept secret, or oh, but hasn't it been long enough? That over these generations of athletes, um, you say they're allegations, but there were enough people in the industry who knew who each other was, to know that, yeah, this has been going on for quite a while, right? And um, as is the case with a lot of abuse situations that don't get addressed or may persist, or any abuse allegation. Safe Sport International has a great statistic, which we'll keep sharing over and over and over, that um, the average age of a person who's abused in their teen years to actually report the abuse is around 55 years old, or 52 years old, sorry, 52 years old. And I have a friend now who's 55, who, when she was 52, met up with her abuser. She was 15 and a half, I think, when it took place, and ended up, all these years later, as a 50-plus-year-old adult coaching a junior volleyball team against her exact abuser, with the same allegations of abuse, for athletes in that time period, which those athletes would have been 15 or 16 years old. And, obviously the coach ages every year, and the athlete's age group, that they coach stays the same. So,
Right.
the examples are usually like, there's a lot of helplessness. There's a lot of, I'm afraid of being punished for saying something out loud, afraid of retaliation. The coach is going to pull my scholarship. Who's going to care what's happening to me? I report to coach, or again, there's always a risk and reward, type of argument, right? Internal arguments like, well, if I risk this, actually I won't get this reward, or I'll miss out on this reward, right? And so that's really a kind of a real, situation. But the worst case, I think, so far, that I've seen, where every element, enablers are involved, uh, coaches, administrators, the community, that really one of the worst cases I think I've ever seen of abuse, is kind of the reason why you and I are here, today, right? And that we're digging a bit deeper into the situation.
So, during your time at World ParaVolley and USA Volleyball and the many other organizations that you've been with, um, the abuse wasn't just like physical, right? Like there was more to it than just physical abuse.
Absolutely. I mean, the examples of abuse that I've seen firsthand and have been involved in cases, right, actually adjudicating cases, um, unfortunately, the majority come from sexual misconduct, right? Sexual abuse, molestation, rape. A lot of it is involving the coach-player dynamic, a kind of supervisor to subordinate kind of situation, if we could equate that to, the workplace. Um, this case I just spoke about, the 30-year long, adjudication process. I mean, that was probably the worst case of sexual misconduct that um, could not be called sexual misconduct. And what I mean by that is, one of the problems that we face not only in our country, but in other countries around the world, is the policies and procedures that are lacking, to protect athletes in these situations. You know, there is an effort, obviously, in the United States, through the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and other organizations, that at least athletes involved in, Team USA sports, right? There's some jurisdiction of new agencies and some new policies that are in effect. However, that really doesn't help the athletes that came before, that before there was
Right.
anything, any trend of safe sport or any best practices or even any acknowledgement that these sort of things happen, right? And so there is this gap, this problem, that in trying to catch up with the cases of the past, the current environment, the current standards, they really don't cover everything that an athlete might have experienced or suffered, before 2017 when the center, came online. I saw a lot of that, especially when dealing with the Team USA issues, volunteering with USA Volleyball. I still see a lot of it, enabler cases, and then there's always the if you're approaching these cases with a victim-centered mindset, there's always the possibility that the victims will become overwhelmed, with the attention, with the having to, being put in a position where they've been having to relive their trauma. Like, why is it them, that has to relive the trauma? Why not the abuser, who has to relive the trauma? Or God forbid, nobody should have to relive, that trauma. But there's the issues where, like, I've seen a case, long-standing case, that was not cleared. The individual was not necessarily vindicated as all the headlines, read, but the victim was essentially shamed into submission, and stopped cooperating with the case, which is very common, right? I don't blame the victim at all. I blame the people who, created this mob mentality that it's not okay for victims of, and that was a sexual misconduct case, it's not a, it is the right of the person who suffers the abuse to do something about it. It's their right. And if they don't want to do anything about it until a certain point, it's their right too, right? It shouldn't be
Right.
the right of the general public or the media or anybody else to force that person to defend their position of being abused just because the abuser wins national championships or has a good win-loss record, or, well, he doesn't look like an abuser. Well, what is that supposed to mean? That's my favorite one. Well, they don't look like they'd be an abuser.
Right.
Well, what exactly is an abuser supposed to look like? So,
Right.
yeah, I really, in dealing with these cases, there is a moment, and I know you understand this, just from reading through your research. I'm sure getting through the research of all the people that you interviewed and interacted with, like, that had to have been a struggle, just by the sheer volume of people that, that you were able to connect with. But, I know for myself, it is extremely difficult now that I've gone into, more international volunteer role with World ParaVolley. I applaud World ParaVolley. Our previous president was very committed to safeguarding, right? Not just of athletes, but of, most of these organizations are volunteer-based organizations. When you go, as you know, right, from your experience in Afghanistan, when you're dealing with international sport federations, it gets even more complicated because you've also got cultural differences, you've got translation and language, barriers. Like, one good example is the word safeguarding, right? No matter what application, you're using for it. Like, it wasn't until I started working in the international space and with Safe Sport International as well that somebody brought up the fact that in German, there is no literal translation for the word safeguarding, right? Like just what
Right.
you're saying about water polo, water, hand soccer in the water, I mean, there is no, straight translation for words like safe sport or safeguarding, like in Arabic, in German, in Italian, in all of
Right.
our languages spoken around the world. Sometimes there isn't a direct translation, right, for what it is that we're talking about. And so it becomes more important to lay out examples, right, examples of cases. In World ParaVolley in particular, we have a Safeguarding Integrity Commission that was formed within the last 2 years. And literally there are people from around the world. Trying to schedule a meeting with this group is really difficult because you're dealing with like 6 time zones, right? But that's the beauty of it, is
Right.
that, if we can bring together more people from different parts of the world to sort of get a baseline, right? What's our baseline for athlete safeguarding? What are the words that we should or should not be using because maybe they don't translate? Like, how do we, be more clear? All of these experiences, hearing the case studies, really is the best way to learn. Unfortunately, right? It is the best way to learn, right? And from our mistakes or from our successes. Um, but it all draws back to, you know, when you are an athlete, especially if you are a young athlete, or just starting out, like, who gives you you get a handbook, you get a rule book, right, about your sport. You get maybe a handbook from your university or your club about, the do's and don'ts, but who gives you the handbook on safeguarding? Right? Who gives you the
Hmm.
handbook to tell you, if I feel like something is not quite right, in the way my coach or this person involved with my club or my, team, and the way that I react to some of the things that they say to me, if they're hurtful, if they're asking too much about my weight or controlling what I eat too much, not in the terms of nutrition, but in the terms of like, why are you eating anything? You're so fat. If you're so fat you can't jump. I mean, really it's the words we use, right?
Hmm.
The hateful words and things like that. Um, really there's very little guidance for athletes. Um, and hopefully that's starting to change, right? I have a great organization that I feel kind of lucky I fell into. Was approached by the Foundation for Global Sport Development a few years ago, Isabel Cathcart, and I really want to point her out because I'm so grateful to her for pulling me into this. But the Foundation for Global Sport Development, which does fantastic work, documentaries and really a lot of support, grant making and grant funding, they funded what's called the Athlete Helpline. And right now it's in North America, but I'm hoping that the model of what they are doing can be implemented in other parts of the world, right? But they've got a
Hmm.
24-hour monitored, helpline. It's actually part of a national child abuse prevention, hotline. But for certain hours of the day, it's staffed by people with athlete-centered experience, with the focus, professionals. And it's not really only just a counseling, helpline, but it's a helpline. It really is a help line, right? If you need some resources in your area for counselors, or if you need to understand what your legal rights are and need to be referred to a lawyer, or if you have some questions about nutrition because you're not, feeling so great and you're being told not to eat this or not to eat that, but you have to eat something, this is a place that athletes in particular can call, to get some advice, to get some support, to talk it out if they need to as well. It is that kind of a helpline. And so I would say, for this series, I just want to really highlight them because, if our viewers are feeling anxious or triggered or, by a lot of what we're going to be talking about, the athlete helpline, and it's really athletehelpline.org, and we'll mark that some information, for people to share during our podcasts. Like, please reach out to them if you feel the need, to talk to somebody, or if maybe hearing some of what we're talking about triggers a memory, or an experience out of your lived experience. Please feel free to reach out to them if you need to, right? And they'll be there during our sessions and during our episodes.
No, thank you for sharing that, Lori. That's an incredible resource, and we'll definitely post that on our website, and also some other places as well. Um, we've talked a lot about different cases that have gone on over the years. Whether it was 15 or 30 years ago, or even if it's last week. Um, Toxic cultures aren't necessarily illegal, when it comes to the law or even standards of an organization. So, can you explain the difficulty of like toxic and abusive cultures and being able to address it through law?
Yeah, well, the best way to probably do that is to go back to that statistic, some facts from Safe Sport International. I think 75% of all cases of abuse go unreported. 75%. Like that's, when I first read that piece of information, I went to them. I was like, "Are you serious? Like, can that possibly be true?" And of course, yes, it is, right? And this was off of a survey that involved more than 10,000 people, right? Um, and the statistic I shared earlier that there is a long delay oftentimes if any reporting can be done that an athlete that is abused in their teen years, the average age of reporting is 52. Right. So sometimes what triggers that is maybe you are a parent who has a child that might just be ready to go into youth sports or, maybe is following your footstep, whether it's in your sport or another, and you see an abuser, a record. And if I mean, I could fund a whole helpline myself if I had a nickel for every time I was, told by somebody, I can't believe I just walked into this youth basketball game and I see the coach that abused me and my teammates is coaching another team, or I can't believe I just walked into this volleyball game and just had to coach against the guy who abused me, and um, I think that's where it starts is that oftentimes, I remember this one case that we did with the 30-year, sexual abuse case. Um, the statute of limitations, right, for criminal acts of abuse, whether it's sexual molestation, and not everything applies. Believe it or not, pushing somebody down in a practice or shouting in their face and invading their personal space, like oftentimes is not a criminal, violation, right? Doesn't violate any law. But for the acts that do, primarily in the area of sexual misconduct, um, there there's all kinds of problems to reporting. Whether the individual feels safe enough to report that a crime actually took place, whether anybody in law enforcement is equipped to approach this from a very victim trauma informed, victim centered approach, or if it becomes more of a you have to prove that you were abused for me to take you seriously, right? It's like that innocent until proven guilty. The abuser is innocent until proven guilty, but the victim has to prove over and over and over again that they were harmed, right? Um, I think there's, on the more kind of personal and cultural side, there's a real aversion to reporting because that somehow makes it more real that the act, took place, right, or occurred. And dealing with trauma, is it's a lifelong endeavor. Right. I mean, you can have many different outcomes or different days that you feel a certain way, but really what we're talking about is trauma, not unlike grief also, right? It's just a lifelong commitment to managing the level that you feel at that time. And sometimes it doesn't play into the picture that you have the opportunity or the support or even understand that some of this activity is criminal, right? And should or can be reported. But most of it is not, right? Most of it is not technically, criminal under the law. And that's the problem is that most abuse occurs in that gray area, right? And that sort of uncharted territory. It's like, well, the police are going to tell me to work it out until something happens, like domestic abuse, right? Okay, until you die, like we can't do anything. Or if you have a stalker, okay, well, until that person actually touches you or invades your home or so, we really can't, we can get them for breaking and entering or something else, but not necessarily for stalking or emotional abuse, right? Or jeopardizing your health and welfare, right? Emotionally and mentally. And that's a problem, right? That's a disconnect in our different systems, not just in our country, but all around the world. I mean, as bad as we think we
Right.
have it here in the U.S., my God, it's 10 times worse in other parts of the world where there is nobody watching what's going on, right? The people who are who are suffering through this abuse are just suffering, like period. Athletes or not athletes, right? So yeah, I think you know, part of the, part of the important, I think one of the important parts of how we change this dynamic, is in the reporting structure, the structure itself, and the encouragement for victims to report. Finding safe places and safe environments for them to report what's happened to them. Um, this case study that we're going to be looking at, really, which honestly is probably the worst abuse case that I can remember ever being, ever being carried out, like, at the level of collegiate athletes. And I'm glad we're going to be spending some time, with the people involved and also some other experts and such. But it's really, the importance of reporting, I think, will come through, right, in these discussions. And um, the importance of holding your space, right? Taking, everyone talks about accountability, and everybody has to take accountability, but how you become accountable to yourself as a victim is, okay, you know what? I deserve to have my situation be resolved, right? I don't deserve to be, abused continually in this situation. And it's okay for me to say stop, and try to seek help, um, to make it all go away, right? And that's, I think, one of the most important themes that will come from this season.
Talking about reporting, during my doctoral research, I asked over 1,100 people. It was actually 1,129 people if they ever had a toxic leader or were part of a toxic organization, and nearly every single person who I asked said yes, and there were only 6 people who said no. So 1,129, you had 6 that were no, so that's 1,100 and 23 people who didn't say no and that they were part of a toxic organization or had a toxic leader. I also asked those same people that said yes, they experience a toxic leader or an abusive leader or toxic culture, if they reported it. And nearly every single person who said yes to that they were adversely impacted or part of a toxic culture or toxic leader or abusive leader, almost every single person said they didn't report it. And
Hmm.
so it's very interesting that you bring up the average age of 52 as people are finally reporting the trauma that they experience, and I definitely believe that,
Yeah.
because it's so hard to report. It's so hard to you're already vulnerable and you're already so far down as it is if you're adversely impacted by toxic or abusive leadership, right? And then to have to not only relive it when you're reporting it, but also suffering the retaliation, the retribution,
Hmm.
and the so many other things that come with it. It's very difficult to imagine anyone who is able to come forward and say this is happening to me, because most of the time, just like you said, they have to prove that it happened to them. They have to prove that someone who everyone else loves is doing something that is not necessarily aligned with organizational values or the law. So
Hmm.
I definitely am very interested to see how this season goes and to listen and see this case study that we're doing, and it's going to be very difficult. I myself have my own lived experiences of toxic and abusive leadership, and so which is obviously, well, it's not obvious, but which is why this was one of the directions I went in my doctoral research, was because I did live it myself, and so it was something that I was familiar with, and then I could start researching. And
Hmm.
obviously, with your career, you've probably, back when you were very young in your career, you weren't leading organizations and dealing with complaints and people reporting, but obviously throughout the time as your career progressed, you dealt with it more and more. And so it's just unfortunate to see. I mean, we're all human beings, just like good things happen, negative things happen, and people make poor choices. And then
Hmm.
obviously they don't want to get in trouble, right? So they'll double down. They'll continue to abuse, or continue just the toxic behavior in general, because they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to lose their job. They don't want,
Right.
something looking bad for them. Like if they're in multiple Hall of Fames, like you were talking about, they don't want their reputation tarnished. And then a lot of people who support them are like, oh, well, look at what this report is doing to them as the
Mhm. Mhm.
person, the coach who's in the Hall of Fame. It's like, oh, the person who filed the complaint is tarnishing their name. I think dynamics, not only in the U.S. Or North America, but the world, we still struggle with that. We think that
Mhm.
the old
Mhm.
school coach who's screaming at their players or athletes, who's throwing chairs and doing all those things. We think that those people in turn will create wins and will put people in seats, and that will generate income for an organization like a professional team or a collegiate team.
Right.
And those are important. And one of the things that we talk about a lot at Culture and Sports, whether it's through the Culture and Sports podcast or the Athletic Approach podcast, or any of our culture roundtables or our annual leadership summit, or even just the articles we write about, we talk about how, and we are aware, and we make sure that other people are aware, is that there has to be consideration to how an organization builds and develops, because if they win, that means more income comes into them. But if
Mhm.
they have an extremely poor toxic culture, athletes are going to be less ready. They're going to not perform at their highest levels, and obviously there's going to be more injuries, more turnover, so on and so forth. And so we discuss positive and negative cultures, equally at Culture and Sports. And this case study is going to be extremely interesting, with what we're going to bring up. One other thing I did want to mention, from my own research, or there's two things. One is that, I 25% more women than men responded to the questions that I asked in the survey, but almost every single woman that experienced the toxic or abusive leader, or the toxic culture, reported sexism, sexual harassment, and assault, in addition to what most males reported. And that doesn't mean that no males reported, sexism or sexual harassment or sexual assault or rape or anything like that. It was just a lot more prevalent with women, right? And so
Mhm.
that's something to consider as we move through. And we're talking not only about this case study we're looking into this season, but into any situation, especially as women's sports continue to develop and to continue to get equal viewership, or attendance at events. This is something incredibly important to think about. The second thing that I
Mhm.
wanted to share is, that a toxic or abusive coach can be successful. Most of the time they're only successful for a short amount of time with the same organization. But a lot of people that I spoke with said, well, yes, they were part of a successful organization, even though it was extremely toxic or abusive. But they said they put the priority to win at all costs, which in turn bred a culture of fear, which also promoted toxic followers. And a lot of times in a toxic culture or abusive culture situation, there are toxic followers who are teammates,
Mhm.
who not only are worried about themselves, but they actually push the agenda of the toxic or abusive coach or general manager or whatever the case may be. And there's lots of different things to think about. And while the storylines may be similar, regardless of the sport or the level of athlete, each situation does look different. There's no one exact definition within sports to say this is exactly what a toxic culture or a toxic or abusive leader looks like, or what they say. It's always different, right? But we still have to be aware. We still have to look for those things. And as coaches and as leaders of sports organizations, do you want to be a one-hit wonder? And your team did really well for one season, but then after that, because of the extreme abusive and toxic culture, they're not going to win after that.
Mhm.
Or and plus athletes are going to get injured at a higher rate. They're not going to perform at the levels they should be. Or do you want to be extremely successful year over year, season over season, and have a positive culture that you're promoting. And that's just something for all of our listeners and viewers to think about is, not all toxic cultures look the same, and not all abusive coaches look the same. And it, it's not just coaches. It could be support staff. It could be administrative staff. It could be, team captains. Like, the toxic or abusive person doesn't necessarily have to be the coach. And so
Mm-hmm.
not all coaches are bad out there. We're not we're not advocating or saying that. We're just saying that a lot of these situations where we do encounter, because of the closeness of the coach and the athlete, that a lot of times the abuse or toxicity, or both, does come from that relationship.
Right. Yeah, and this is something that no matter what sport you're talking about, right? This research that you've done, and the cases, and the case in particular that we're going to be following this season, it can apply to any sport, right? You could literally take the sport
Mm-hmm.
and replace it, soccer, volleyball, football, basketball, tennis, cricket, lacrosse, no matter what it is, and there may be some subtle nuances, but these cases are representative of what is possible and what is probably happening in a lot of sports, with toxic culture or in a toxic environment. Um, Another statistic to keep in mind for the season is that 75% of these cases go unreported. Right. That to me
Mm-hmm.
is, still to this day. I mean, although it's been years since I've, heard that statistic and learned about it, like it still resonates very strongly because, in my own experience now in an international federation, especially an international federation when there's a lot of gender equity, between male and female athletes, male and female administrators, that, we do have a number of cases. And it's always this way. When you institute a athlete or volunteer safeguarding program, there's a abundance of cases from the past that typically get reported, and people realize like, okay, now I finally have somewhere to go. So you are dealing somewhat, with things that may have occurred in the past, and then of course you shift to dealing with present day, and then you finally get around to okay, how can we um, be proactive about trying to prevent some of these cases from happening in the future, right? But to your point, the the abuse, and what it looks like, right, still is the part that's undefined, right? Because I myself have experienced, to your point about the sexism and the misogyny. I had the same individual in my sport of volleyball. Um, I remember I had every job, right? And when I used to sell volleyball equipment and be a sponsor, this person in their sponsorship solicitation to me and my company started talking about, my weight or my appearance. Like, oh, you couldn't possibly have played volleyball because, you're Native Hawaiian, or aren't you Samoan? I'm like, well, gosh, I would sure be proud to be, part Samoan, but I'm part Hawaiian, right? And if my legs are a lot bigger than you like, well, that's too bad, that's too bad for you. Well, the same individual years later, we're talking, 20, 25 years later, felt it was okay to make another comment shortly after I was elected, to be the chair of the board of USA Volleyball, that they had to redecorate the boardroom now because they had an Oriental chair. So not only was the verbal abuse, misogynistic, it was also racist, right? So in that case, really what we're talking about with, with these cases and moving forward is like, how do you define the abuse? How do you identify it? Right. And what definition, or category that
Right.
exists or doesn't exist does it fall into? And then how do you go about dismantling it in a toxic, environment? Sometimes it's not possible, right? And we've seen examples of good people having to leave terrible organizations because like it's overwhelming, right? The task or the responsibility of trying to right the ship at that point is just it's unmanageable. And then of course we've also seen institutions and organizations change or dissolve, or somehow be severely impacted by revealing its toxic culture, right? And even going so far as to adjudicating some cases, whether at the criminal or civil level. But what we're seeing more and more of today is a realization that it is okay to talk about your abuse, right? It's okay to bring it forward, right? Those same elements of, you mentioned a lot, retaliation. That's the word I think I hear used most often, with victims that are considering reporting, what's happened to them is the fear of retaliation. And it's not just the
And I
victim.
mean, it's not
Sometimes
just
it's
the retaliation. I mean, because a lot of the time, these athletes are still under the same coach. So,
right,
I
right,
mean, yes, it's retaliation for reporting, but they're already being, poorly treated or abused, and then it just makes their
right.
situation that much worse. And that
That's right,
toxic or abusive person is enlisting more help from other people, just to make the
right,
situation
right.
that much worse for the athlete.
Well, and it's that enlisting the help. This is another reason why I think there's not a lot of support in the reporting structure. Is that oftentimes, in one particular case, I found there were um, actually the attention became focused on a coach because of sexual abuse among female athletes, and it took a while for this case to be reported. And at the time that it finally got reported, when 20 plus years had transpired, from the victim's lived experience. The coach was coaching male athletes who then stepped forward or tried to step forward to reporting agency and detail the slightly different type of abuse, more hazing, bullying, physical abuse that was happening to them by the same coach. And an a university academic administrator who was trying to be an ally, right, to these athletes ended up losing their job because of taking that position. So the retaliation, the impact, the effects of abuse, it yes hits hardest on the person or persons receiving the actual abuse, but and suffering from it. But it also takes its toll on those who are trying to advocate for victims' rights, or the people that they end up going to for help, again, who are outnumbered in the system. Again, if it's a toxic culture, right, you're pretty much outnumbered if you're the only one who's not buying into or just flat out ignoring the toxicity. And the impacts are felt, in that area as well. So again, another barrier, to reporting or to seeking relief or seeking safety, is the fact that that abusive culture, right, is part of the toxicity. It has a
Exactly.
different face, right, depending on how it's dealt out, right? The abuse can be person to person, peer to peer, or it can happen very subtly behind the scenes in the form of inactivity or people with a duty of care, to be responsible for not only athletes, but the people who are there to support those athletes, including the academic instructors and counselors and staff at the university. It's like when people in positions of athletic director or a chief administrator or president of the university, if you are in a position of power and you don't act and you don't empower the others in those positions to act as well to prevent these types of situations, I'm sorry, but you are part of the problem, right? You are the root cause of the problem. So I'm glad we're going to also be taking a look this season, at that sort of layer, of the toxic culture,
Mhm.
the enablers and such.
We're nearly out of time here, but wanted to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us for our fourth season of the Culture and Sports Podcast. But before we conclude this episode, Lori, can you please share with our viewers and listeners what we expect in the next episode of our show?
Right. So, we've been talking about this case study, and some of you may have already, read the articles and such. The Orange County Register in Southern California and an award-winning reporter, Scott Reed, broke a news story toward the end of 2023 about multiple players on the University of Idaho women's volleyball team who had suffered through an alleged abuse, physical, emotional, mental health, jeopardizing their mental health, verbal abuse, against their head coach. A head coach who, as far as we know, and from following the articles and the reporting done from outside of the state of Idaho, this head coach is still employed. This head coach is still responsible for coaching these athletes. The university is not only aware of the complaint, there is a 10 plus page complaint that was filed by athletes from the 2023 fall women's volleyball season. However, in uncovering this case, the abuse dates back to the coach's arrival on campus in 2022. I think the statistic was close to 70 players had transferred out of the university or had left volleyball altogether over the last 2 seasons. Um, and it's a fascinating, case. We'll hear from Scott Reed, the reporter who broke the story really through some investigation of his own, and that will be very interesting to hear, what led him to that case and such. We're going to be hearing from some of the women on the 2023 roster who filed this complaint. And we'll be also hearing from, what's really interesting about this case, Jeremy, is we're also going to be hearing from women who played for this coach, and some of the stories that they're sharing now, in having tried to warn the University of Idaho athletic director Terry Golick about the tendencies of this particular coach when they heard he had been hired. So we're talking back in 2022. Um, what's even more fascinating, it's an open case. And we'll hopefully be following along this season as well as to the status of an investigation that's ongoing right now at the University of Idaho, an internal investigation. Um, I think, from a teaching standpoint, sort of a learning opportunity, this is a um, very unique case where almost every angle that you see coming off of this initial reporting delves very deeply into some of the most troubled areas of athlete abuse. The barriers to reporting, the identification of abuse, the enabler system that allowed this particular individual, this head coach. I think I read in the article, over 21 years had been employed at 15 different institutions, where now there are at least 7 or 8 athletes from those past institutions that have gone on the record with the register, um, sharing, the warning signs, things that they witnessed, other athletes that were, physically harmed, whether it be a season-ending injury, overtraining, or being pushed to the ground by this particular coach. Really, it's a fascinating and heartbreaking case study that we'll be digging pretty deeply into this season.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode of the Culture and Sports Podcast. We hope that this episode has started an internal dialogue, or even one with your team, about the importance of leadership and organizational culture. If you'd like to learn more about culture and sports, the Culture and Sports Podcast, or other programs, go to cultureandsports.com, where there is a wealth of resources, articles, research, podcasts, video shows, webinars, and courses. And don't forget to connect with us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn at Culture and Sports, and on Twitter at Culture in Sport. Thank you for tuning in to the Culture and Sports Podcast.